All right, let's jump into another deep dive. You know we love to unpack the big question, grifter or gifted. And today we're tackling a legend, a comedic icon, the one and only Chevy Chase.
He really is a fascinating figure, isn't he?
Absolutely. Because on one hand, you've got the undeniable comedic genius, the impact he had on, like, the whole landscape of humor.
Right, his influence is massive.
But then there's the other side of the coin, the reputation, the stories. Let's just say he's known for being a bit difficult. So, where do we land with Chevy Chase? Visionary who pushed the boundaries of comedy, or con artist who's just riding the wave of fame?
Well, that's what we're here to figure out, and we've got some great sources to help us dive deep.
We do. We've got articles about some recent comments Chase has made about his career, kind of reflecting back on things.
Always interesting to hear what someone has to say after some time has passed.
Totally. We've also got his Wikipedia page, which honestly is a wild ride of highs and lows. And then some deep ties into his time on Saturday Night Live, Community. Oh, and that short-lived talk show back in the 90s.
Oh, yeah. That talk show, even Chase himself has admitted it was kind of a disaster. He said he felt pressured into doing it and wasn't really passionate about the format.
It definitely makes you think, right?
Yeah.
Like, if he wasn't really all in on the project, was it just a paycheck thing? Is that like a classic sign of the grifter mentality?
That's a great question to consider. But I think to really understand Chase's motivations, we need to go back further, back to the beginning. Because his background is pretty surprising. I mean, even for someone in the world of entertainment, it's unexpected.
Oh, yeah. Fill me in.
All right, so he was actually born Cornelius Crane, and get this, he was adopted into a wealthy family. You're talking like deep roots in New York City. His ancestors were mayors. There's even a Mayflower connection.
Whoa, wait, the Mayflower?
Yeah, seriously. So this guy has a pretty privileged background.
You'd never know it from his comedic persona, though, right? Like, he totally shed that whole upper crust image.
Totally. He embraced this role of the bumbling, relatable everyman, which, when you think about it, is super interesting.
It really is. Like, here's a guy born into wealth and privilege, but chooses a career built on making people laugh, often by playing the fool.
Exactly. And that makes you think, like, what drives someone to comedy in the first place? Is it that genuine desire to connect with people, make them laugh, or is there something more? Maybe a deeper need for attention, even if it comes at the expense of others.
Oh, that's a good point.
Something to keep in mind as we unpack all this.
For sure. But, I mean, there's no denying that whatever that drive was, it took him straight to the top. Especially in those early days on Saturday Night Live. His persona, that mix of, like, clumsiness and charm, but also that slightly edgy attitude, it was gold. I mean, audiences loved him.
Yeah.
And who could forget that famous fall during Weekend Update?
I mean, yeah, that's iconic.
Right. You could even argue that moment cemented his comedic legacy.
It definitely became part of his comedic DNA, intentional or not. And it's funny, like, you think about how many comedians who came after him have a similar style,
Right.
They're embracing that self-deprecation, that willingness to, like, push boundaries. It makes you wonder if Chase's success paved the way for that kind of persona in comedy.
I can totally see that. But there's that thing about pushing boundaries where sometimes it goes too far,
Yeah.
And with Chase, we can't ignore the accusations, the stories about him being difficult on set. There are stories about name-calling, even getting into physical altercations.
Like the Bill Murray incident.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's like legendary in SNL history.
For sure. And I think even though some people might try to defend Chase's actions as like, oh, it was a different era, it's important to acknowledge the impact his behavior had on the people he worked with,
Absolutely.
Even if it was unintentional, which maybe it was, who knows, but he created a really hostile environment for a lot of people. And it makes you question, like, did his comedic talent justify that negative impact?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, even back then, there were plenty of successful comedians who didn't resort to those kinds of tactics. So was Chase just unwilling to adapt? Or did he genuinely believe his talent gave him a pass?
It's a question worth asking, right? And it becomes even more relevant when you look at his behavior on later projects, like Community.
Because there, the pattern seems to continue.
Yeah, I mean, there were accusations of racist comments towards Donald Glover. And that's not something you can just sweep under the rug. It's serious.
No, absolutely not.
And it seems like that pattern of controversial behavior just followed him throughout his career. Like, it's interesting to look at his recent comments, especially in that Mark Maron podcast interview.
Oh, yeah. The one where he basically dismisses Community.
Exactly. He said it wasn't funny enough for him and that he was happier being alone.
Which, wow. And the way he talked about leaving the show, it was just, like, there was zero remorse. He even said he didn't regret being fired and didn't want to be around those people anyway.
Yeah, pretty harsh. So that leads to an interesting question for our listener. What do you make of those comments?
Yeah, what do you think? Is it genuine indifference,
Yeah.
arrogance,
Hmm.
maybe even like a defense mechanism? It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely adds another layer to the whole grifter or gifted debate when it comes to Chevy Chase.
No doubt about it. And it makes you wonder, did this whole lone wolf mentality contribute to the downfall of his talk show back in 93?
Yeah, because you know that talk show, it kind of flopped, and it's a great example of how Chase is like his style, which totally worked in those sharp bursts on SNL. It just couldn't really carry a longer format. You know what I mean?
Totally. Like the Chevy Chase show, right? It was supposed to be this massive comeback, but then it just tanked, canceled after, what, 5 weeks?
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, even back then, that set was so weird, you know? Basketball hoops, toys everywhere. It felt more like a crazy playroom than a serious interview show. Exactly. It felt all over the place. And that might actually reflect this kind of key tension in Chase's career. Like, his instincts, comedically, often brilliant, no question, but they didn't always translate to different contexts. So you're right, in a talk show, viewers want a certain level of, I don't know, like professionalism, some structure, and Chase's energy, which in small doses can be super charming, in a nightly format, it kind of became overwhelming, maybe even off-putting.
Yeah, I see that. So maybe that's part of the grifter side we're looking at, right? Like, did he take the talk show gig just for the money, the spotlight, even if he wasn't the right fit?
It's possible, for sure. But we also have to consider he later admitted he felt pressured, like pressured into hosting the show and wasn't super committed to the idea, which actually raises a really interesting question, and I'd love to hear what you think about this. Is taking on a project, even if you're not totally passionate about it, is that automatically a sign of being a grifter? Or could it be that Chase really thought he could make it work, even if he had some doubts?
That's a really good point. It's easy to judge looking back, but we weren't in his shoes. Maybe it was a mix of things, right? The pull of that big comeback, maybe misjudging his own abilities a bit, pressure from the network. It's really just one thing.
Exactly. And it's important to remember, even the most successful people, they make mistakes, they miscalculate, it happens. The question is, do they learn from those mistakes and grow? Or do they keep making the same choices again and again?
Right. And that brings us back to community, right? Because it seemed like the perfect chance for Chase to kind of reinvent himself, find success with the new audience and new generation. But even there, the same patterns kind of pop up again.
Yeah, it's true. And it wasn't just those alleged racist comments towards Donald Glover, which are a big deal, obviously. But there were also reports of like clashes with the writers, disrupting production. It's like he was resistant to being part of an ensemble cast, even though that's kind of Community's whole thing, that strong dynamic.
And I love the Joel McHale's response to Chase's recent comments about the show, remember? Like, Chase was saying he was happier being alone, and McHale just goes, no one was keeping you there. Such a perfect, like, mic drop moment.
Oh, totally classic McHale. And it speaks to something bigger about Chase's career. He seems to have this idea that he was the reason for his success and kind of downplays everyone else around him.
So maybe that is a sign of the grifter mentality, right? Taking all the credit, not wanting to share the spotlight, wanting to be the lone genius, even when you're in a collaborative space.
It's a really interesting theory. It makes you wonder if that mindset held him back in a way. Like, what if he had been more open to collaborating, learning from others? Maybe his career would have gone in a totally different direction.
It's wild to think about. But no matter where you land on the whole grifter or gifted thing, you can't deny that Chevy Chase's legacy is super complex. He's this comedic pioneer for sure, but also his behaviors cause a lot of harm.
Absolutely. And that's what makes him such a fascinating person to analyze, right? It's this idea that brilliance and controversy, they can totally go together. It makes you think, is there some level of ego or even darkness that comes with comedic genius? Or can you achieve that kind of success without leaving behind all these damaged relationships?
It's a huge question. It makes you wonder, what if Chase had been more self-aware, managed his behavior differently? Could he have done even more? Or was that, that difficult personality, was that somehow part of his brilliance?
The million-dollar question, right? It's almost impossible to separate the art from the artist in this case. And that's why, dear listener, I'm going to leave you with this. Where do you land on the whole grifter or gifted spectrum when it comes to Chevy Chase?
Yeah, it's a real head scratcher.
Yeah.
And speaking of legacy, can't forget about the Community movie finally happening. Most of the original cast is coming back,
Yeah.
Joel McHale, Danny Pudi, Allison Brie, all in.
Except for Chevy Chase, of course.
Exactly. Like, they didn't even think about asking him, you know?
Yeah.
It's almost like they're trying to separate the show from him completely.
Yeah. Well, I mean, with all the stuff he said recently and the stories about the tension on set during his time on the show, it makes sense, right?
It does. But it does make you wonder, like, what if? What if Community could have been even bigger without all the drama that came with Chase?
That's a really good question. I mean, yeah, having him there at the beginning definitely got people watching, no doubt. But then you could argue that all that stuff, all the controversy around him, it kind of overshadowed the writing, the rest of the cast.
Right, because they were brilliant.
They were amazing. So yeah, it's like the classic double-edged sword thing, working with someone as talented as Chevy Chase, but also as unpredictable and kind of volatile. You get the comedic genius, but you also get all the potential for like disruption and chaos.
And in the end, it feels like the scales tipped more towards the chaos.
Which is a bummer because he was so talented. But talent can only take you so far, right? Exactly. It's a good reminder, a cautionary tale almost. Success, especially in a field like entertainment where it's all about collaboration, it needs more than just talent, right?
Oh.
You need to be self-aware, you got to respect the people you're working with, and you got to be a team player.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the world of Chevy Chase. We've seen his rise to fame, talked about his comedic brilliance, his flaws, his legacy. It's complicated.
Super complicated. I mean, we've gone through all the evidence, looked at things from all sides, and now it's your turn, listener. It's the question we always ask on this show, grifter or gifted. What do you think about Chevy Chase?
Leave us a comment. Let us know. And thank you for joining us for another deep dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating look at someone who's out there shaking things up. And we'll be asking, you guessed it, are they changing the word or just lining their own pockets? See you next time.